Hello, and welcome to our live webinar on building competitive tracking systems based on scenario planning. My name is Cam Mackey, and I'm the Executive Director of SCIP. For those of you who don't know, we are the Strategic and Competitive Intelligence Professionals, and we are the global nonprofit that supports excellence in the practice of competitive intelligence and strategy. I'll be moderating today's session. Now, today is really exciting. It's a joint effort between three great organizations, Fletcher CSI, Contify, and SCIP. And the reason we're cooperating and collaborating on this is because we believe this topic is so critically important. So we've come together today to demonstrate how scenario planning and market monitoring can be used to prepare for multiple future scenarios and target markets, and most importantly, to fuel competitive action. Thanks again for joining us. Now let's introduce our experts for today. We'll have Erik Glitman, Mohit Bhakuni, and Meena Almaula. I'll let them introduce themselves. Over to you, Erik.
Well, thank you very much, Cam. It's a pleasure to be here with you and Mohit and Meena for our presentation today. My name is Erik Glitman. I'm CEO at Fletcher CSI. We are a primary data collection and analysis firm specializing in scenario planning support and competitive insights. We've been around since 1988. It's over 30 years for those of you whose math is not as quick as you'd like it to be. And we manage a lot of our clients' competitive intelligence, competitive insights activities. Our goal as a business is to help our clients make better strategic decisions and continually improve their market position.
Excellent. Great. Thanks, Erik. Hello, everyone. I am Mohit. I'm the founder and CEO of Contify. I have been working at the intersection of technology and business information for the last 20 years, since 2000. I started as an analyst with Deloitte and have managed businesses, media businesses, especially around business information for a couple of large media houses. I started Contify in 2009. It's almost 12 years ago, over 12 years now. And at Contify, I spend a significant part of my time and energy on the development of our competitive intelligence platform. And our purpose at Contify is to help professionals make informed decisions. So we help businesses become more competitive by providing them information that is beyond the four walls or the walls of their offices, which is their external environment. That's the market and competitive intelligence. And excited to be here, to be a part of this webinar. Thanks, Cam.
Great. Thanks, Mohit. Meena, last and definitely not least.
Yes, the third musketeer, but hi, everyone. It's really good to be here. I'm very grateful to Mohit and Erik to have invited me for this webinar. My name is Meena Almaula. I work with the Tata Business Excellence Group in India, which is a division of Tata Sons Limited. And we kind of are a group that kind of owns the business excellence movement within the Tata Group. And within that, specifically, I work in the areas of competitive intelligence and strategy. And we are helping group companies who want to kind of adopt CI or want to improve their CI activities. So I'm part of the improvement interventions team, as we call ourselves, and we're kind of here to help within the Tata Group company. So I'll be talking about that shortly. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Meena. Thanks, Mohit. Thanks, Erik. So we've put together a great team, so let's maybe talk about the game plan for a moment. So we'll start with an overview of scenario planning, indicator development, and market monitoring. Next, what we'll do is move on to the process of setting up scenarios using a framework called STEEP. That'll help us classify trends. After that, what we'll do is understand how to link scenarios to event indicators, and then how to use these indicators to build monitoring programs. Last, we will discuss establishing action plans, probably most importantly, on these indicators. So throughout, we'll have some short polls, so definitely engage with those quick polls, and we'll ask how you're using scenario planning currently. Afterwards, we'll of course share the results with a little color commentary. So as you can see here, scenario planning is a very critical strategy tool used by organizations around the world. So what we're going to do today is give you the tools to overcome 3 common mistakes. The first is cherry picking scenarios. That's picking the most favorable ones. That's mistake number 1. The second most common mistake is not including a monitoring and implementation step. And finally, the third mistake is not building strategic responses into those events. So our speakers today will present tools to avoid these 3 missteps and also to increase the value of scenario planning. So feel free to drop questions in the chat section, or the questions section rather, go to webinar. And we also have 2 polls to understand your views, which will help us cater how we structure the conversation today. So let's start with poll number 1. We'll come in a moment. Great. So how often do you update your strategic plans? Every year, every 2 years, less than every 2 years, or what is a strategic plan? So no wrong answers here. If you could just take a moment and select your choice about how often you update your strategic plan, that will be great. So I'll give everyone about 10 more seconds to do so. Great. And then what we'll do now is kick it off to Erik to walk us through 3 missteps focused on scenario selection, indicator identification, and market monitoring. So Erik, what do we do so that we don't make these classic blunders?
The classic blunders are relatively common, more common than you would think. And there's really, part of it comes from a misunderstanding or a misapplication of scenario planning itself. So the fundamental purpose of scenario planning is really to create a basis on which you can build strategic models for a world that is changing, or an environment, a business environment that is developing and becoming dynamic every year. Now, there's very few business environments we've ever been in that are stable year over year. So having these scenarios, being able to look forward and anticipate what might happen, is a very fundamental and important part of running any business that's out there. We build scenarios by looking at current trends in the market space or in your business environment. And we like to look at them through a lens of what we call STEEP, which is an analysis tool that, combined with industry knowledge, helps you understand where things are going. The scenario itself is really just a story. It's a narrative about how current trends, things that are happening today, will impact the future in 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, depending on your time horizon. A really well-developed scenario identifies the change from today to the future, to the scenario, which gives us indicators of what must change from today to that future, and helps us build out some indicator monitors. Specific changes that must happen, things that must happen from today to the future, those are our indicators. The indicators, again, form the basis of monitoring, and that's done by focusing on an event. When the event happens, that's an indicator. The strategy you might have put in place should be implemented. So we're doing this, and we're helping to develop these action plans based upon the indicators. Mohit's going to add a couple more points on this.
Thanks, Erik. Yes. So, as you said, indicators form the basis of monitoring. Right? It's difficult to predict the future, and we can be better prepared for it, for sure. As Erik said, the underlying drivers, the indicators, is extremely important to have a good understanding about these things, so that we can take the permutation combinations and predict the possible future scenarios. And second step is to closely monitor these indicators to know how things are evolving. And it's important that how the iterative process works. That is the step that you mentioned, Cam, in the beginning, which we will be highlighting here. At a high level, a scenario planning is a stage before we take that strategic and make the hard choice and take that strategic decisions and decide to take the company in a certain direction, which means saying no to the other options in other directions. And that's why it's sometimes a bit scary. It can have serious repercussions in the journey of the company if we don't get it right. And having this science and technology planning in a proper manner, we can be better prepared to take informed and smart decisions, and especially the important ones.
So as most of us know, strategy, as Mohit has said, is about making choices that are long-term choices and articulate a competitive advantage that you want to create as a company. Scenario planning is about asserting control over the uncertain situation by identifying assumptions of the future and determining how your organization is going to respond in that future when those assumptions or the events happen. Key thing is you have to be prepared for different scenarios, and you need to have a description of possible future situations. Again, that's the scenario that you may need to act on. You need to change gears swiftly when something happens.
Great. Thanks, Erik. Thanks, Mohit. Meena, anything you'd like to add there?
Yeah, no, I just totally, I agree with both. I think the key thing here is to prepare. I think that's also a very kind of strong benefit of doing competitive intelligence is that you have to be prepared. So, whatever scenario, if you can kind of adapt, the quicker you can adapt, the better for you.
Excellent. It's a great point, Meena, and it's a nice segue to our next section here. So I think three of you done a great job kind of laying out the roadmap. So let's start with actually setting up these scenarios. How do you do it? Any tips and tricks here? And I'll ask Erik and Meena. And Erik, I'm going to pick on you first.
Well, thank you, Kim. So talk about the theory itself behind building a scenario. The scenario itself, as I mentioned earlier, starts by identifying current trends that will affect your specific industry. Now, we believe that one of the better tools you can use is what's referred to as the STEEP tool. Now, the STEEP stands to look at trends that are affecting society, technology, the economics, the environment, and politics. There are variations on this. You may have heard of PEST. PEST looks at politics, economics, society, and technology. There's PESTLE, which is STEEP with an L added in there for legal. There's another one that covers for military industrial, and there's even one that has a second environment. Environment can be the natural environment, things like climate control, preferences towards recycling and energy recovery, so on and so forth. But environment can also be the business environment. How competitive is your market? How dynamic is your market? So we want to bring all of those in and project trends in each one of those STEEP factors, as we call them, and say, what will this look like over our time horizon? So for this session, we're going to look at really one example, which is going to be something that's partially in process. And that's a scenario where we're working as an auto manufacturer and we're concerned, we have a belief that by the year 2035, 60% of all personal vehicles will be 100% electric. So we want to look at that and say, what are some of the things that Steve might look at? As an example of that, we're sharing something that might happen, a societal trend that's going on right now. There's social pressure for use of electric vehicles, EVs. They're seen as a status symbol in some areas. Remember, going back 5 or 6 years, all of the Hollywood celebrities had to have the Tesla or the latest machine. And that was signs of being cool and hip. And it was a way of virtual signaling. So there's very much a role of societal push on that. And in a scenario, we say higher levels of social acceptance indicate that there will be greater use of an electric vehicle. Likewise, in technology, there's been a push for higher battery densities. Initial electric vehicles had ranges in the double digits of miles or double digits of kilometers, 30 miles, 60 kilometers kinds of things. We needed higher density to make them become really viable alternatives. Early models of electric vehicles had multiple charging ports, so you had to get the charging port for just your particular vehicle. So there had to be some changes to implement better battery life, more universal charging points, charging speeds. It couldn't be something where you had to park your car overnight to get a charge to drive 5 miles the next morning. Matching performance of the internal combustion engine in terms of 0 to 60, in terms of range. All of those pieces have a role in the scenario of will EVs be possible in 2035 by talking about can they be treated as an ideal or identical replacement to an internal combustion engine. We look also at economics. as a scenario. In order for EVs to be there in 2035, the low overall life cycle cost of an electric vehicle has to be equal to or less than an internal combustion engine. There has to be utility support for home charging. Or if you're in a large multifamily dwelling, there have to be multiple charging ports instead of just car garages. All of these affect on the economic side, the total cost outlay, making sure that your internal combustion engine and IV engine vehicle are roughly the same, reducing barriers to entry. We had some environmental trends that were coming out. Climate change, having effect in all decisions people make about what they buy, how they travel from point A to point B, where they consume products from. All of that has become very much important in our society. EVs are a way to demonstrate a total lower environmental cost, less emissions, less cost of environmental degradation through oil pollution, so on and so forth. All of those are a way for the environmental impact to demonstrate that an EV has a lower total environmental footprint than an IC, which supports the environmental goals of reducing climate change in the minds of a lot of people who support that direction. And finally, we looked at trends in political issues, government investment in EV infrastructure, which means municipalities putting in charging stations at their parking garages, continued tax incentives, which means the federal government or the state government or other organizations providing you a tax benefit of purchasing an EV over an IC, or putting an in-home charger if you have that capability. And even seeing on the politics where politicians are running on the basis of their support for and advocation for EVs as a platform and where they go. These are the kinds of things that, again, reduce EV barriers to entry. So all of these kinds of trends, we put them together and said, does this indicate a world in 2035 where EVs would be common? And this is a way to take a look at that impact. Now, I do want to add one key point on this. In this case, all of the trends we have identified are going kind of normative. They're staying at their current rate. Trends and projections for the future should include three other variables. In addition to the normative, things continue as they are, there should be one where things get much better. For example, they may increase at a faster rate. Where things get much worse, meaning the forces that are helping move the trend forward decline or reverse, or where there might be a complete wild card that comes in. And we'll talk more about those as we go on. So what we want to do is sort of bring this out from the theory into real practice. And Meena, perhaps you'll share with us your experiences on that.
Sure. So I'm going to talk about a few indicators that one of the Tata Group companies considered before starting to supply components for electric vehicles. So this company actually conducts pestle analysis, like Erik mentioned earlier, on a fairly regular basis, and they found kind of a few indicators from their analysis that triggered their foray into EV components. So one was the market trends. Market trends to them showed that the value of the engine was getting transferred to other elements. So they found that about 70 to 80% of the value moved to two parts of an electric vehicle, the powertrain and the electric drive. And therefore, this company felt it was in their favor to kind of become a player that supplies the very heart of the car, so to speak. And then they also looked at customer demand trends. So they saw that consumer focus was moving more away from the look and feel of components. That was kind of losing importance. And they were more interested in technology-based requirements like sensor-based seats, heated seats, safety features, etc. Also, of course, like Erik mentioned, the political encouragement was, in 2015, the government had a huge push, the Indian government, this is push towards electric vehicles, and they had a scheme called the FAME scheme, which stands for Faster Adoption and Manufacturing of Hybrid and Electric Vehicles. And this was introduced in 2015. So they kind of, in order to create demand for electric vehicles in the country, and they had a variety of subsidies, especially in the area of employment of manpower. Another area they looked at was the competitive environment. So they did notice that non-automotive players were beginning to enter the market with new technologies. And they, of course, wanted to protect their own market and not miss out on the opportunity. And lastly, of course, they also, most of their clients are OEMs. And so they decided to, really make a push into the electric vehicle components area and become an end-to-end supplier. So of course they couldn't do this on their own, so they decided to join with some Chinese companies, and that way they can provide the full range of EV components, from motors, controllers, integrated drivetrains, battery packs, battery management systems, as well as EV chargers. Of course, another scenario was to not really do anything, which I think also Mohit mentioned earlier, to not do something, So that was one of the options, and they could have continued with their current production of ICE and looked for some alternative areas to grow. But they really did find that EV components kind of complement their current production line. And if they do it in a kind of a more gradual, modular fashion, it would mitigate any risk of investing in the EV industry. So this is one real world example of steep trends of pestle in this particular case. That was one of our group companies looked at.
Excellent. Meena, Erik, thank you. So that's a great overview of steep, pestle, pest, and probably the other 10 variants that Erik had mentioned. Now's the time for a poll. So we will pull up a question here to take the temperature of the attendees. So our question is this: does your company use scenario planning to develop strategies? And the choices, as you can read: no, you don't. You might, but you're not part of the process. You do, and it's done by marketing or strategy. Or you do, and it's involving people from all over the company. So just take a couple moments, select the choice that best suits you and your current organization, and we will share the results afterwards with everyone, along with some color commentary. Great, excellent, folks. So let's now switch to our next section. So now, what we just described, that was only one scenario, and that seems pretty carefully chosen for an outcome in one industry. In that case, obviously automotive. Now we talked about not cherry picking, that being one of the key mistakes. How could this scenario be presented in a different way?
I think that's a really important distinction of presenting the same scenario in different ways. What we've put together is essentially a normative, as I mentioned earlier, a normative scenario, one in where trends stay at a pretty steady rate towards that EV rate. But there should be other options. Some examples that you might include in it. The trends turn unfavorable. Battery capacity plateaus. Right now it's been increasing, but all of a sudden if battery capacity plateaus, and you can't get any further distance out of your vehicle. You can't make it go further than 120 miles or whatever the current limits are right now. That may limit the ability for people to choose an EV over an IC, depending on their needs. So that would be a kind of unfavorable trend. Or something could become very much more favorable. An example of that is some European cities are now banning internal combustion engines from city centers. That could spread far and wide, which again would increase some of that kind of limits or demand for EV vehicles. But the other one that we should always add is a disruptive case. Meena mentioned an example of a disruption when she talked about non-automotive players coming into the automotive market. Other examples of that, we might find out that someone develops a very cost-efficient and extremely safe hydrogen-fueled internal combustion engine, which would have even lower pollution effects than the EV. So we need to have multiple scenarios like this, because what we're trying to look for is specific strategic actions that work in more than one scenario. A strategy plan based upon a single scenario is almost certainly going to fail, because that one single scenario is unlikely to happen. But one that's based upon multiple possible scenarios has components that are likely to work and be more robust through all of that. So that's how we avoid cherry picking. We pick deliberately things that are not as good or better than we might like it to be.
Excellent. So that was great. So we have been given some guidance and a case study on how to avoid, mistake number one, which is cherry picking. So now let's talk a little bit about linking scenarios to event indicators. Where do you start?
Start at the beginning is usually a good place. But remember, in scenarios, we have this future state. We've identified a market that is not presently the one we operate in. But in order for us to get from where we are today to that future state, certain things have to happen. Certain changes have to happen. So one of the tools that we can use is start from today and work forwards, or a little more exciting, start from the end point and work backwards. What has to happen at each process along the way to get us to that end state? It's nice to start at the back end because then you know what are the last three things that have to happen before this scenario can come through. And we might pick for the EV, there might be something along the range of the last three things for EVs to be ultimately successful is they have to have a range of 400 miles, which I think is about 800 kilometers, and they have to have a recharge of about 25 minutes, which is about how long it takes to fill a tank of gas for a car. If those two things happen, then people will be willing to buy an EV. Add in a third place that it's no more expensive than typical internal combustion. Boom, everything's happened. EVs are now fully competitive. So work back from there. What does it take to get charging down to 20 minutes? You might have to have infrastructure with very high voltage, very fast chargers. You might have to have ubiquitous charging stations, meaning a charging station is everywhere where a gas station has been. Your battery power density has to change. These are all things that are not present today, but when they all come together, the future happens. And then we work back another step from there. All right, we don't have ubiquitous charging stations today. How far can you go between a charge in an average vehicle? Right now, if you have, and I'm just making this up, 10,000 gas stations per million vehicles, do you have to have 10,000 charging stations per million EVs? And maybe you've only got 5,000 today. So we now have a path. If we go from 5,000 to 6,000, suggest we're making that direction towards the 10,000, and so on and so forth. So these are all precursors to those final triggers in the end state. In order to get to that ubiquitous EV, we need to have distance, rapid charging, equal cost, which means we have to have steps along the way back. And those are what we refer to as the indicators. So taking our example of the electric vehicle, when we look back at the future state, which is ubiquitous vehicles, electric vehicles, we might say that first indicator, where we are today. Again, let's go back from level 3, everything works. First indicator, distance has to be 120 miles, which is, if I'm mistaken, about 200 kilometers when fully charged. 50% of all charge ports have to use a universal plug to put in there. 50% of all public parking lots have to have at least one high-speed charging station. And 80% of EV vehicles can have a 0 to 60 miles or 0 to 100 kilometers performance time that's about within 80% of the average internal combustion. The next level says we're going this way. EV distances go to 180 miles when full, which I believe works out to about 250 plus or minus kilometers. 80% of all EVs use the same port. It's bad news for Tesla with their special port, but we got to get to that point. And 75% of all public parking lots have ample high-speed charging. At the 0 to 60 miles, 0 to 100 kilometers, same time as what you would get with an IC engine of the same vehicle type. Last indicator, we're up to 300 miles on a full charge, which is about 500, 600 kilometers. 95% of all these EVs now use the same port, meaning no matter where you pull in to stop with your EV, you're going to find a charger. And 45% of all public parking spots have high-speed charging, so you don't worry about getting your charge. And now They outperform the IC engine. These are precursor events leading to that final indicator that says EVs are going to make it. So, Meena, perhaps you can share us a few examples you've seen from the real world.
Yeah, sure. Sorry, are we on the right slide? So yeah, so clearly, I mean, I think what Erik mentioned about, these kind of factors have to happen. So one of the companies that is in the EV manufacturing space definitely thought that it was critical to provide a seamless charging experience in order to generate demand and increase the number of customers and accelerate the adoption of EVs. So this EV manufacturing company realized this quite early on, and they thought that by exploring synergies within the Tata Group for charging infrastructure, it could be more proactive and a little bit ahead of the curve and address the anxiety of having a seamless charging experience for EVs. So rather than manufacturing the cars as well as the charging stations, this company kind of partnered with a utility company within the group to install high-speed charging stations, which really helped to kind of address the barriers towards EV adoption. In fact, the example I just shared, this talks about one partnership, but actually 6 Tata Group companies have come together and joined hands, and they've actually created an EV ecosystem called Uni-EVverse, so universe with the EV in capital. And they've kind of manufactured batteries, auto parts, cars, charging stations. So they're really providing an entire suite of e-mobility services, from retail to like even financing options. So I thought that was actually a very interesting example that how they're all coming together. And another example of a trigger that was emerging would be about the dependence of lithium. So as most of you know, most EV run on lithium batteries, and although India has some of its own reserves, India imports a lot of lithium needs, mostly from China, Australia, and the United States. And lithium extraction is quite intensive and harmful to the environment. So in the long run, this might not be such a sustainable, method, and it will be tough to keep up with future demand. But India is also the 4th largest producer of aluminum, and so and production has been increasing steadily, and that's actually aluminum is much cheaper. It's a very viable option as compared to lithium batteries. So this company is really kind of investing and in exploring the benefits and researching the use of aluminum air batteries and the use of course, alternative materials too. So this company hopes to be ahead of the curve, is preparing for a possible future scenario, and hopes to be better prepared as compared to its competitors. So I think as Erik mentioned, this is kind of really, they're kind of waiting to see which trigger points get hit at what stage, and hope to be prepared enough to handle those.
That's great, Meena, and I think it's a good reminder about our second mistake, which is not having an ongoing monitoring program. And so, put another way, this whole process is not set it and forget it. You need to find those indicators and have mechanisms for an ongoing monitoring program. And we'll have Mohit talk about that in a moment. But first, I'd like to tee up our next poll question. And it's about the impact of scenario planning. So how much impact does scenario planning have on your market and competitor monitoring program? So first choice is it drives all of it. Second is about half of our monitoring is based on scenarios. And then third is not at all. We monitor competitors and markets for changes. So which best captures your approach towards the impact of scenario planning? Give everyone a few more seconds. And then Mohit, let's kick it over to you to talk about how do you actually use the indicators to build monitoring programs? How do you put these into action?
Thanks, Cam. So this is the third misstep that we spoke about earlier. Defining the scenario, understanding the various underlying forces and indicators, but failing to monitor the market, to monitor the evolution of how things are changing, and failing to come back and adjust the scenarios based on the new information that we are finding. Erik and Amina has wonderfully explained the idea, the concept behind scenario planning, and what I'm going to go now deeper into the actual tactical implementation of a monitoring platform and review and set the expectations, what to do and how to get the most out of it. So at a high level, the process of setting up such a platform starts definitely with the indicator development. Now, as Erik said earlier, identifying what must change from today to the scenario in the future is the basis for this indicator development. Now, the important part is that no algorithm or technology can tell us what are these indicators. These have to be developed by the professionals, by the practitioners who understand the market and the industry and how they evolve. After these indicators are identified, this clarity of what we need to monitor, what decisions are we going to take based on the things which are changing, what are the possible future scenarios that we're going to prepare for. This happens with the setting up the indicators and what are the sources of such indicators. How should we track them? Now, sometimes we expect a lot more from the intelligence platform, especially when it is under the umbrella of artificial intelligence. But this is the part where artificial and human intelligence, the technology and human have to work together. So how it works is, if after defining the indicators, identifying the sources where we should track and what kind of information we should track. These could be regulatory bodies who are publishing new guidelines. These could be governments deciding what push they want to give to adopt certain kind of vehicles, technologies. And based on this sources, then we define a structuring of this unstructured data, the taxonomy. We define how it should work in the platform, how it should get the update. With this aggregation, this is the step one, which is driven from the indicators. Then we start extracting the intelligence from this data, which is specifically how the indicators that we are monitoring are changing. And this platform, which should allow to collaborate between the different teams, different professionals, different persons, to leverage the kind of information which is inside the organization but not properly utilized. I think that's one of the most undervalued source of intelligence when it comes to understanding what the markets are and how the scenarios will unfold. Then based on this actionable intelligence that we are able to extract, we take the strategic decision. Now, what I'm going to do is explain or illustrate all this, what I just said, using some example, tactical example from the platform. So if we move to the next slide. Yes, so what I'm showing is that the concept of STEEP, the society, technology, environment, economics, and politics, we use this high-level categories to define the structure of the information that we are capturing. It could be any framework that we are choosing, which is relevant for our industry, our business, our company. And for each of the categories, we define what are the important drivers, the indicators that we need to monitor. In this example, we are talking about charging points or batteries. And this structure is going to give the intelligence or the market monitoring platform the basis where information is not just captured, but structured for easy analysis, for extracting the insights, for trend analysis as we start moving in the future. Yeah. And after the taxonomy, we then the next slide, please. Yeah, the information that starts coming in is updating the platform, which is only with the strategically important updates for continuous monitoring of those triggers. Right? This is in our experience, in our users, what they say is that this is like a Facebook or a Twitter or a LinkedIn newsfeed, but only for the updates relevant for the scenarios that we have defined. And And what we hear is this far more addictive than the social media news tweets that we capture. Can we go to the next slide, please? Now, the updates is what is coming, which is the raw information, even though it is cleansed, structured properly. But then when we have to extract the insights from those individual updates, now this is where the machine learning or natural language processing and text analytics, those are the kind of things they can help us in consuming a large amount of information in a very smart and intelligent manner. So, as an example, Meena spoke about the government push towards subsidies, right? And it's not a one trigger or indicator event. It is a concept and idea, and different governments try different methodologies. And in one such example, I just picked it up for the demonstration. The system is able to extract insights from a completely unstructured raw text paragraphs, specifically picking out that the government is now applying subsidies this year through a new method called sliding schemes. Now, to be able to do this kind of insight extraction manually using a human analyst across the thousands of updates that we get, it becomes humanly impossible. Yeah? So these platforms, these systems is smart once we know what are we looking for. It's like a radio telescope. If you know it can listen to anything, but we have to configure and fine-tune it to listen to the right kind of indicators so that we are always on top of things. Yeah. Move to the next slide, please. So even if we look at an article and individual insight, this is not a trend. This is a specific event that has happened. To be able to identify trends, to do the analysis, we have to start looking at the information or the intelligence over a period of time. And for that, the platform should be able to visually represent the data, the things that we have captured. And by changing the timelines, we can see in the journey that we have traveled so far, 3 months, 6 months, a year, what has changed clearly and categorically. And based on the things that are changing, we have to go back and start looking at what is the new information based on which we have to now recreate or refine our scenarios that we are targeting towards. Now, this is not the end. If you go to the next slide. The system should be able to distribute the information to the right audience. Usually what we have found that most of the practitioners, professionals are busy in their daily tasks. They are busy with achieving what they are supposed to do for the quarter, but they sometimes don't get the opportunity to look into the scenarios, how they are evolving by logging into different platforms. So the system at the right time, when the right indicator has met the threshold, the system should be able to trigger the alerts personalized with the indicator to the right audience. And another way to consume this information to the right audience is to generate this curated market intelligence newsletter reports, which is on a periodic basis, could be fortnightly or a monthly, and keeping everyone updated that this is what we assume, this is what are the hypotheses and the scenarios that we've created, and these are the way things are changing and evolving. And at the periodic interval, we go back, look at what has changed, and decide what should be the right strategic decision that we should make. So a short example of how these platforms can be used to implement the scenario planning and stay on top of the game and become more competitive. Cam, over to you.
Thanks. That's fantastic. So, what we saw there was a mechanism, a process, and a tool to monitor and then to share, insights based on those indicators. So let's start transitioning rather towards the final goal, which is to avoid the last mistake of not having an action plan. So when you find the indicators, so how can a monitoring program help with this? So as the lead-in, we're going to ask our final poll question here, and it is: how do you determine if a competitor or market event is significant? Choices here: first, you report on events, and the stakeholders decide. Second is we develop measures with each stakeholder, and then finally, we use a company-wide criteria based on strategy. So pick the one which best fits your organization about how you determine if an event is significant. And then with that, I'll kick it over to Erik.
Let me unmute before I bring my conversation back here.
We've all done it, my friend. We've all done it. It's okay.
Yeah, a side comment from it all. I've been saying this for the last year. This will be known. The phrase that will forever be linked in with this was, "You're on mute." We'll all know what it means 20 years from now.
We'll all know. We'll all know.
So back to where we are. Really, in order to act when a trigger event happens, we have to have, one, the alert, which Mohit has talked to us about, but we also have to have pre-positioned almost or pre-planned actions that will come in place when that trigger is reached. So basically, there are things that a company has to do. And Meena, I'll let you come through with this and talk about some of the ways that your experience has been of companies imposing those triggers or using the triggers.
Sure. So, I mean, basically, I think a company kind of has to make a choice about how the company will operate differently based on such a trigger. So, as I said earlier, it's really about making that choice. Now, what's going to happen? So, you have to make these trade-offs, and you have to choose what you're going to do and what, of course, you're not going to do, which Mohit mentioned in the beginning, and then have mitigation steps that are planned according. So I think, to be honest, it's really about exercising your options in the optimal way based on the market scenario at the time, based with the information that you have at the time. So to be honest, it's really like life, life decisions. It's more or less the same. So yeah, that's how it works.
I love that, Meena. It's just like life. I mean, it's a good reminder, right? That even though some of the things that we've heard today, it's don't cherry pick, don't make assumptions. Don't just say you said it and forget it. Have these ongoing monitoring tools and event specific triggers, and then using those triggers to drive action. Even if some of these things might be kind of obvious, they're fantastic reminders that if you don't do them, you're putting your company at a pretty big competitive risk. So with that, I would just love to turn to each of you and any final thoughts as we give folks an opportunity to think about any questions they might want to ask you in our remaining time here. Erik, I'm going to pick on you first for any closing thoughts.
And I'm not on mute, so that's a good sign.
There you go. There you go.
So really, what we as a group hope you've pulled out from this is there's a couple of clear, defined actions that work. Start by identifying trends that affect your business, the area you're in. Extrapolate those trends into the future so you can build scenarios that are realistic based upon what today looks like and what tomorrow might look like if today continues. I will add a caveat on that. In scenario planning, there's a huge tendency to, as a friend of mine once said, Martians land and solve all the problems. Wishful thinking shouldn't be in part of your scenario planning. Make it realistic. But the scenarios themselves, as Meena alluded to, they help define strategic choices. They help determine what must change when the scenario is developed and present choices of how you will react in each one of those changes. They're not prescriptive. A scenario is not something that absolutely will happen, and you should never develop 100% of your strategy based upon a scenario. Rather, it is directive, directionally accurate. It talks about what has to change in order to go from current trends, current position to future trends, and gives you the tools to identify when those changes are happening and implement strategic actions in response to the change as it happens.
Excellent. Mohit, can we kick it over to you for any parting thoughts from you?
Absolutely. Cam, you mentioned about this scenario of planning, how we are doing this. We did a poll also. What we have seen in our experience in the companies lies in the spectrum where it's not done at all completely. And then there is an extreme version where companies like Exxon doing it for 45 years down the future. What I think very strongly believe that this is not to be made overcomplicated, like Erik said, a directive, not prescriptive. The key term that is missing is in our implementation is the next milestone. What happens is we try to achieve a big goal, and it is such a big goal that we try to say, okay, we will do it when we have time and resources and blah blah blah. We are busy, but if we have a clarity on okay where we are right now and this is the next milestone we have to achieve, which is realistic, and it is, to be very honest, not that difficult to have basic scenarios in place and start tracking how things are evolving. So the next step is extremely important to be clear, and taking that step is extremely important.
Excellent. Meena, let's turn it over to you for any final parting thoughts from you.
Yes, I think Erik and Mohit have covered it well, but yes, it's really about being prepared. Don't let things derail your original strategy. So that's how, by being prepared, you're ready. So hope for the best, as Erik also alluded to, and be prepared for the worst. That's kind of how it would work. And I think companies definitely need to have this. I do, as Mohit also mentioned, I do see at the Tata Group, there's quite a variation in how this is used. But I do see SWOT, for instance, is of course very commonly used, and PESTEL, some companies do, some don't. But I think they are keeping an eye, but having a structured process and it being continuous, as you mentioned, Cam, I think is absolutely critical. Have that radar on all the time.
Excellent. Well, thanks, folks. It's now we have a few minutes for Q&A, and our first question up here, Mohit, I'll direct at you because you brought up, I think, Exxon a moment ago and their 45-year time horizon, which holy moly, I can't even think of what I'll be having for lunch in a couple hours. So good for them. What are some of the best time horizons to use in scenario planning so that you don't get overwhelmed?
Absolutely, a very good question. And this depends upon, like a consultant, I'm using that word, I don't like that word, but it depends upon the changes in the segment where we are operating. There are certain segments that are moving and changing really fast because of the technological disruptions. In that, we should not have beyond 2 years or 3 years scenario. This is long enough when things are moving fast. If there are things which are more stable, doesn't change much, which I honestly fail to see which industry now is stable and not changing anymore. But if it is a highly capital intensive, like a shipbuilding kind of an industry, then we can have a longer term scenarios, maybe 5 or 10 years. Yeah. So it depends upon which segment and how quickly it is changing.
Excellent. Erik, Meena, any thoughts on the time horizon question?
Yes, my general recommendation to our clients and to anybody else who's doing scenario planning is you should probably look 1 to 3 business cycle or product development cycles into the future. That's enough time that you can act on change, and it's also very flexible. If you're in a very fast moving industry, that might only be 9-10 months. If you're in, as Mohit says, if you're in shipbuilding, that might be 20 years. But if you're looking 2 to 3 product development cycles out, it's enough where you can make an action and see the results come into effect. It's not so far into the future that who knows what would happen, and it's close enough that all of your stakeholders will say, yeah, this is realistic. I can see the path from where we are today to where we want to go.
Excellent. Meena, any thoughts on that question?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I've actually seen it in action, and I agree with Mohit that I have seen that the industries, the technology industries that are moving faster, they actually moved from a scenario of 5 years to 3 years. So they've brought it closer. But the only other thing I would like to add is that, also revisiting the scenarios is critical too. Like not just do it once a year and then, we'll think about it next year. Kind of have, keep an eye on it is something we also recommend.
I think, it's a great theme you mentioned there, Meena, which has come up several times today. It's this notion of this isn't just a process you do once a year to check the box and then you don't refer back to it or don't have indicators to kind of revisit it. So maybe let's talk about trigger events a little deeper. Every industry, of course, is different, but any advice on how to think through picking which trigger events might be important versus which ones might not? And this is a free-for-all, so whoever goes first gets the stage.
I'll jump in quickly. We like to use what's referred to as a probability impact matrix, sometimes also called a probability impact grid. And essentially, this ranks each one of those trigger events on two axes. One, what's the probability that it's going to happen? And two, what's the impact it's going to have on the business? Obviously, something with a high probability that will happen and a high impact is something that should be given more attention, more focus in the monitoring and also in the strategic response that's going to happen. Something with a high impact but a low probability gets put off into that, let's monitor it and see what happens. We don't need to worry about it just yet because the probability is low. We'll also find when we put together these matrices that there are a certain number of events that have an uncertain probability. There are things that might be 2 or 3 product generations out that require a number of precursor events to happen. But if they have high impact, we do still need to monitor for the things that might or that are necessary in order for this uncertain probability to go from uncertain to a certain probability. So that's a tool we found very useful, ranking things. How likely is it to happen? What's the impact if it does happen?
Excellent. Mohit, any thoughts on that and determining the trigger events and as Erik said, kind of the probability?
No, I think Erik has answered it pretty exhaustively, so no other additional points on this one.
Perfect. Meena, has Erik covered that one from soup to nuts?
Yeah, so the thing is, it's interesting because the Tata Group is very diverse, and so this kind of ranges very differently amongst all the group companies. But one of the group companies has actually built something to similar to what Erik was describing, called the competitiveness index. Sorry, and so they kind of use different triggers and monitor this constantly. So that's one example of what we've seen at one of the group companies. But yes, I think more or less the probability of something happening and how it'll impact you is a very good approach.
Excellent. Well, folks, we have about 90 seconds left. So this is not enough time to ask a question, give each of you an opportunity for a thorough response. So maybe I'll put you on the spot, and in the spirit of what's one thing in a sentence or two that you'd like attendees to do or think differently after this webinar, what would that one thing be? And Mohit, I'll start with you.
Try trial version of Contify.
Nice. Someone needs to drop a link in the chat to do that. So, okay, perfect. So Mohit's one takeaway is try a trial of Contify. Meena, how about you?
I prepare. Like you have to kind of look at this continuously and prepare as much as you can. We don't know what's going to hit us.
And Erik, what's that 1 or 2 sentences on what you want folks to do?
Well, I'm going to take advantage of what I refer to as informational asymmetry and informational advantage. I know something the other ones even don't. 69% of our respondents said they do not use scenarios for competitive intelligence monitoring. You need to have a reason why you're looking at things. Build scenarios, figure out what's important to monitor, so you are monitoring not just what's happening today, but towards what might happen in the future based upon the trigger events that are identified through scenario planning. You can call us, we'll be happy to help you with that. But call Cam as well at Skip, join Skip, find a lot of good service providers out there as well.
Definitely. Meena, Erik, Mohit, thank you so much for your generosity and sharing all your experience and insights with everyone. You have the contact information up here. We will share the poll results, the slides, recordings, and all the good stuff. Thanks, everyone, for a good session. Keep safe and see you soon.
Great. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.